How timely things unfold in life. 2 years since Michaela's brutal murder today. I thank you, panelists, for being here and sharing this and trying to contribute something that may make a difference. Today I received, timely again, a letter from Peter Hall, Michaela's father. He said, "Thank you for your message, Michael. We are now waiting until September to have the 5th pre-inquest meeting and an inquest late February 2024. Last Friday, we had to listen again at the 4th pre-inquest preview, the PIR, to the failings of so many organizations of people who should have been there to protect and help Michaela. They, all agencies and personnel involved, just need to join the dots and really care and understand. We're very grateful to you, Michael. You continue to bring together others who may help victims of domestic violence. I still trust that the coroner will reveal the true horror of the catalogue of poor judgment, poor training, neglect, and just not caring that surrounds victims like Michaela. The families of these victims, like us, must be heard and listened to and brought in to help. The damage that data protection laws, the GDPR, HIPAA, etc., 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 has caused, and how many hide behind this, is immeasurable. There must be a thought as to how we can overcome this word that is bandied about: capacity. Does one, such as Michaela, really have capacity when one keeps going back again and again and again for more? Again, thank you for your help. The help you gave to us and tried to give to Michaela. They are having to relive over and over and over again the details of Michaela's brutal murder, what led up to it, the interventions. And this is a terrifyingly sad aspect of families of people who have been murdered in domestic violence, and surrounding how it could have been different. And that's why this panel's together today from different walks of life and different disciplines in the world of domestic violence, to maybe make sense of what Michaela's law can do in order to be proactive and preventative in the world of domestic violence. So, welcome, panelists. I have been in this field of family trauma for 30 years plus. I have colleagues and dear friends and family that span the medical, legal, and social policy fields, and the charitable non-profits. I know that I've made mistakes in my career that I've learned from, and do better for those that depend upon me because of these. Each of my friends and colleagues and family all admit to making similar mistakes and having been able to do things better. Error is part of being human. However, policy is largely made by people that are not qualified or experienced to do so. We are told to do things a certain way by policymakers. Our safety is in the hands of people who do not see the whole picture. Mistakes are being made over and over and over again. This is not acceptable Thus, we need to make a law that protects us. Yes, us. Where all possible abuse cases. It's not them or those. It's our collective human experience. Today, I saw the news, and Professor Stock, ever present in the news right now for opposing transgendered rights of access, she addressed Oxford University in the UK. In my opinion, she is rightfully defending people, women, who are being put in danger. Put in danger due to a blanket policy ruling made by people who are not knowledgeable enough to do this safely. Michaela's killer and others like him are the first to use and abuse this type of policy that is set to give trans people rights and choices, but is lamely structured. It is an open door to all those that wish to abuse the policy and people. This is a stark example of how we humans get it wrong, how departments are not working together, how mistakes are made over and over and over again. We must bring in a law that takes away the greyness, the mistakes made at the chalk face. We are all the gatekeepers of domestic violence. Everyone on this panel today are gatekeepers of domestic violence. We panelists are unclear of how a case of domestic violence is managed, lost, mistried, dropped, or even used against the abusees and their families. Gatekeepers of domestic violence are abusees' family and friends, social workers, mental health practitioners, medical personnel, lawyers, judges, cops, drop-in centres, self-help groups, abusees themselves, and as Peter states, we are not connected enough. We don't have enough common ground, and there is too much confusion. Too much to do a good enough job and keep people from harm. Hence, Michaela's law. Without using up any more of our precious time today, I'd like to welcome our panelists and say a heartfelt thank you to each of you for being here. You are sincerely welcome, and over to you, Judge Sarah Zabel. So what do you say about Michaela's law, Sarah?
I don't think there's enough time to, there's to have this discussion because there's so much to say. So I'm going to try and put it in words that communicate the heart that you just said, Michael, because so many words. And, in the world of domestic violence, just like in human trafficking, and I speak from some like you, over 30 years of experience, being on the bench as a lawyer, but more so from being on the bench and seeing these cases, unfortunately, as these victims travel through the court system. And a lot of the times these victims decide not to prosecute or go forward because maybe there are children involved, maybe, as you mentioned, family members of the abuser have somehow gotten to them and made them feel shame or guilty themselves when they're the victims to not go forward. And then they, unfortunately, they drop the case. And then what happens, right? And unfortunately, when something tragic happens, there is not a tomorrow. And as you said, and I think you're right, we're all mandatory reporters. right? And I want to talk about the signals, because sometimes, and I defer to you and the professionals and you as, in your profession, because I do believe the signals that we see are are obvious. We see the signals, and who are we? Should we step in? There are so many people who ignore those obvious signals and don't step in. As you said, so many times the ball is dropped. And when you have so many different agencies involved, unfortunately, as we all know what the B word, bureaucracy, means, unfortunately, when you have so many different agencies involved, that's when the ball is dropped, and unfortunately tragedy happens. How do we prevent tragedy? Wow, I wish I had that crystal ball. I really do. We have to be insightful, right? And I would say, if I'm on my part here, if I speak about the judiciary, and I say this with respect, we all see things through a different lens, right? Just like judges bring their own life experience to the bench. Some judges who go on the bench have been touched with domestic violence in their own family. They're not going to say it, but they have. So they have life experience. So, but then there are judges who they're insulated. They have no experience whatsoever with, and the court system, they do have training, but I don't think it's enough. It's never enough. And unfortunately, when you have some judges who, and I'm not disparaging the judiciary, but some judges don't see what another person sees, right? Through the lens of us, right? And where I could see a signal that is so obvious, and I can, as a judge, say and call it out and try and enter, make a decision on whether an injunction should be entered or not. Another judge may see it differently. Another judge may see the facts differently. And unfortunately, that's just the reality that we have. And just being a pragmatic person, that's just, the court system is what it is. It's inherently flawed because we're dealing with human beings, right? And how do we do better as far as our judges? I think more training. And you mentioned too, and when I started on the bench, I was in the dependency system, foster care, and these children, so tragic. A lot of these children, whether trans children or children who were being abused, sometimes in their foster home, ran away, and then they became victims of human trafficking. How do you stop it? How do you put a plug in it? I think we as a community and community leaders need to all be on the same page. Sometimes, respectfully to all the community leaders, sometimes we're not attached to each other, right? Sometimes we're not, the left hand, the right hand. If we were all working together hand in hand, and I would defer to you, and I think it goes along with what you were saying too, in a maybe more articulate way than I did. What I am saying respectfully is that I think community leaders, and I see in my incredible leader with a women's fund here, who I admire greatly, and all of you, is to do better where we're working together and we're not working separately. And I think, is it going to make an absolute difference? That's yet to be determined, but I do think it will make an impact. Look, we have cyberbullying out there, social media, the good, the bad, and the ugly, right? And once you ring the bell, you can't unring it. And I'm the chairperson of the Commission for Women. And we've had this discussion, and we've had police officers come and speak to us in workshops, and about human trafficking. And I ask about the trans community. And unfortunately, I get a lot of blank stares, and that's horrible. That's horrible. So we have to do better.
Thank you, Sarah. I think I echo exactly what you're saying, but also, although Michaela was a woman and there are women's issues, domestic violence knows no boundaries. Men, women, children, parents, etc. They're all part of domestic violence. I just wanted to broaden that out slightly. Australia did bring in a new law, and the law took away the powers of agencies such as us, lawyers and judges, etc. Took away the powers of police and the abusees themselves. And if you notice, I'm actually using the word abusees because there's so much political correctness about all the other terms we don't use anymore, we do use. So I decided a neutral way is abusees. But Australia brought in a law that the courts actually, they don't accept that. Michaela withdrew her cases so many times in her lifetime of abuse. And finally, her murderer killed her, sat down, poured a glass of wine and watched TV. And that's the truth of it. So if Australian law had been in power in the UK at that time, her rights would have been taken away from her once the abuse was reported, and then the abuse can be listened to in a court of law and debated and then tried appropriately or not tried. So what, we haven't got long, we've got a couple of minutes, but what would your take be on if I gave you a magic wand, and we can't bring all the agencies together? I mean, even agencies argue amongst each other. I mean, I go onto a panel, or I go onto the news, or I'm in a magazine or TV, and I get attacked by people because I said the wrong word. They you know, I've done this, but they focus on this bit here, and they take, and it's part of being in the public eye, it's part of being in a debate or a panel. So there is that interagency disharmony that happens because we all have our own sights on what we're supposed to be doing or not doing, and sometimes the boundaries are blurred. But if I gave you a magic wand, what would you bring in to law now based upon Michaela's story, based upon this interagency issue and subjectivity? You talked about courts and judges. We all have our own subjectivity, but all have our own world experience. What would you actually say, what we need to put this into the law?
Wow, that's a great question. And I mean, children, men, women, the elderly, you know, it's not age specific as far as abuse is concerned. So if I had and you're right, and I think some of it has to do with money and funding, unfortunately, you know, that's true too. If I had a wand, I would, you know, I would want, and I don't think that's going to happen in the United States regarding taking the authority or decision making away from the courts. I just don't think so. But I do. I mean, if I had a magic wand, I think money, certainly funding, and the ability to have more training, honestly, because with education brings knowledge. And I think whatever agencies, whether or not they're working together and everything's inextricably intertwined, I think if I had that magic wand, at the top of my wish list would be training, more intense training, not superficial training, training where you can see those signals, training for schools, across the board, so I think at the top of my list, it would be really intense training.
Great. Well, thank you so much. It's always good to see you. I know you can't hang around for the whole thing, but please stay for as long as you can. And at the end,
Thank you.
we will give you a full version of this so you won't miss anything.
Thank you.
So thank you very much. Next, Caroline, author of Narcissistic and Toxic Relationships. Thank you and good to see you again.
And you, thank you for having me on. It's an absolute honour to be here, particularly with the panel that you've assembled. So thank you for that, Michael. I think for me, you know, my story is a very personal story. My reason for being here is a very personal one. You know, having you know, come through two narcissistic abusive relationships, and I think that the thing for me that really shone out more than anything else is the fact that it's that sense of denial. It's the fact that we don't think that it's happening to us. We don't think that we are what the look of an abusee. We're not what that looks like. And I think in both of the instances where it's happened to me, and particularly one that happened more recently, I've actually been, I'm going to say, fortunate enough, because it's unfortunate when you meet other people who have encountered the same experience, you know, by the same abuser. But it's fortunate when you do get to speak to them. And particularly in the most recent case, I have 3 other women that I'm in direct contact with from the same abuser. And that, you know, that spans back about 15 years of this individual's behavior. We know through other people of 2 other women, you know, in relation to the same individual. And the reason that I raise that is that what's fascinating is that, you know, we've all had an experience with this individual. I have to say that their experience with this particular person was I'd say worse than mine. But none of us have gone to the police. None of us have done anything about it because we just don't think we'll be taken seriously. We don't think we'll be believed. There has been so much, particularly in the UK press, about the attitude of particularly the police force. I'm going to call out specifically attitudes to women, and I, you know, I can only talk from the point of view of being a white female. So that obviously that is my lens of the world, but there has been a lot in the press around attitudes to women in particular, about belief around abuse or harassment or violence. And the police, as you'll be aware, Michael, have had, you know, a very bad press in relation to their handling of cases of women where it's been violence, where it's been, you know, there's been murder cases, been some very high profile ones of the ways in which it's been handled in the press, some very tragic cases in recent years. And I think as women, we feel that we won't be heard. And I think that's one of the key things for me, that we need to start listening. And listening when people come forward. I mean, I think it is, for me, in terms of, you know, my research for today and my ongoing research in the topic areas that I write about and I speak about, you know, it is interesting that, you know, I think in the year ending 2020, the figures for convictions for coercive control in the UK, 97% of those convictions were against men. So I think that there is, you know, there is a place for us to talk about gender, and I know that's very difficult for numerous reasons. And like I said, I can only talk from the point of view of being a white female, but I do think that there is a place where we need to talk about gender differences. And I understand, you know, there are, you know, of you know, all genders, people who suffer abuse, but I think some of the numbers speak for themselves in terms of the bias of that against women. So I think that there's, you know, there's a lot that needs to be done in terms of our attitude, actually, just even in the first instance, to accepting what abuse is and understanding what it is and what it looks like. Because I think, again, not in any way to you know, to undermine anything that happens to anyone in the subject of abuse, but the reality is that when somebody gets physically hurt, physically abused in some way, you sort of have something to show for that. But when that abuse is coercive, narcissistic, I always talk about it that it's like a dripping tap on concrete. You know, in my experience, any one of the things that happened to me could be explained away, but it's the culmination, it's the accumulation of all of those things. And I think that's the big challenge that we have. It's that when when that tap drips on that concrete, eventually it starts to make an impression, it starts to corrode. And that's what happens with coercive control and narcissistic abuse. And I think that's the shift in our mindset, our thinking, our understanding, our education that needs to move with it. And so I think in relation to Michaela's law, which I absolutely, I'm so passionate about this subject area, because I think we need something that like legitimizes this type of abuse, that like puts a flag in the sand and goes, this is real, this is a thing, this is something that happens to people, and it happens way more than we talk about, and way more than we sort of feel comfortable with talking about. So I think we absolutely need that law. I think that there are other laws that we can turn to. So in the UK, we have Clare's law, which is specifically around domestic violence. And I think in Clare's law, there's the right to ask, to request information about whether somebody has a criminal record, a violent past. If you're getting into a relationship with them, there's the right to know. So it allows the police to disclose that. What I think is great about that law is the fact that it's not just the individual. It is friends and family and people who are concerned for that person can also make that request. And I think in if we're bringing in Michaela's law, I think that right is really important, because I think that in one of the situations I was in, other people could see it before I could. And so I think that's really important. I had friends and family members who were starting to ask me questions about this person's behavior, and I was in denial and I couldn't see it. So I think that concern that other people do have.
It's the gatekeepers you're talking about. Being visible is what I'm hearing. We need to be visible. And Michaela, although she was brutally murdered, and it was a terrible murder, she was coercively controlled for years. And it was exactly that, the drip, 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 and most people I've worked with over the years they're exhausted by the time they get to the point of, do I stay alive? Do I leave? What do I do? Exhaustion. And what I'm hearing you say is that Michaela's law may need to have something in it to make people visible, but more than visible, to be believed, irrespective. And unfortunately, we get the chances in the world that abuse laws. So there will be people like the Me Too movement is very, very important, but the falsified documents, people that jumped onto falsified cases also happened. So we've got to be mindful of that, and the law's got to be mindful of that too, and the judges have to be mindful of that, and the clinicians have to be mindful of that. How would you say we could introduce one element of making people such as yourself, and thank you for sharing that, such as yourself and writers like you, how can we make people, irrespective of the type of abuse, how can we make them feel seen by the law?
I'd agree wholeheartedly with Sarah in terms of, I think education is absolutely key. And I think for me, it's at grassroots. We need to start educating at school level about, appropriate behaviors and boundaries, because by the time it happens to you, you're in it. So we need to create awareness. So I'd wholeheartedly agree with that. And I actually, for me, if there could be something in the law that actually flips that scale on its head, that says, the more this goes on, the more we see the need to intervene, because actually we see that this person isn't able to do something about it. They're not able to leave. They're not able to act. And a bit of like you talk about with the law in Australia, it's like actually take it out of the person's hands. It's like, we see you, we hear you, we see how exhausted you are, and you are just doing everything you can just to get up and breathe in and out every day. And that's as best as you can do. I think it's about flipping that on its head. And it's like, if you've been here several times to this person in whatever capacity, whichever agency that is that's turned up, then it gives them the right to go, this is telling us we have to now intervene.
The fact that police would say, and I've spoken to many police over my career, you know, how many doors do we kick down, and then what's going to happen to our paycheck or our job if we kick down every door that we actually respond to? That's another part of it. And the other part of the flip side is the falsifying cases. So a lot of police are called when there's an argument going on, and the woman or the man, or the man and man, or the woman and woman, whatever the demographic of the couple is, they're calling in the police to actually bring in extra tools for abuse. And sometimes the abuser brings in the police to help them create more abuse. So I think we do need to go to a safe place, such as a courtroom or somewhere, because we haven't got a clue sitting here with this panel. Look at the knowledge we've got sitting here and the experience. So, and on that point, I'm going to go to Steph. Steph is a family lawyer Stephanie, sorry, I call her Steph, but Stephanie. So a family lawyer in London, and a dear friend, and I've known her for a lot of years, and she's very good at her job. So I'm interested to hear what you say.
Good evening to everyone. Michael, thanks for organising this, and lovely to meet so many knowledgeable, experienced people. Anyone who's read my profile might think I'm a slightly strange addition to this panel, because I'm predominantly a commercial solicitor working with business owners. I've got a fairly mixed bag of clients, but they are mostly men. And although a lot of them come to me for business needs, they are also coming to me sometimes for divorce and child access needs. I'm going to be possibly slightly controversial in other ways as well, because I'm looking at it from a slightly different angle. Whilst a lot of my clients are simply arguing over money, sadly there are far too many arguments over children. And I'm not going to tell you that I think all men are saints, and that many of them are blameless in the situations they find themselves in, but I have seen far too many examples of women, and occasionally men, accusing their exes of things that there's simply no evidence to suggest has ever happened, and no reason to believe that what we're being told is the truth. Nevertheless, in my experience, the minute a woman alleges domestic violence, the normal rule of law, which is, as we all know, innocent until proven guilty, goes out the window. And the men that I've been representing are suddenly faced with an uphill battle to prove that they've done no wrong, when proving a negative can be extremely difficult. I can tell you about cases where men have been excluded from their children's lives for months, sometimes years, and many give up, not because they're in the wrong, but because they simply don't have the money or the mental strength to deal with the constant onslaught of allegations. With courts seeming to take the woman's side, and in this country, women being entitled to legal aid simply by saying that they have been the victims of domestic violence. Not only is this damaging for the men that I represent, but also for the children, who are often wrongly deprived of relationships with both parents. Obviously, I'm not saying that every woman who alleges domestic violence is lying or exaggerating it to either get revenge on their ex, or sometimes exert pressure as some kind of power play or financial strategy. I'm very aware of how prevalent violence against women is. However, there are far too many professionals who are not asking the right questions. I've had cases where legal representatives on the other side have called me up personally, saying that my application for access to a child amounts to a travesty of justice. That phrase was actually used. And that as a woman, I should be ashamed of myself for facilitating the father trying to see his children, when there was no reason to believe that my client was anything other than a loving, caring father to his 3 young boys. I've had a client in my office in tears when a CAFCAS officer, a social worker, ignored a court's direction to disregard allegations of domestic violence because there was simply no evidence to support the allegations. In fact, there was evidence to the contrary, so that a whole report was produced on the allegations, even though the court had already ruled on the point. More time and money was wasted because the CAFCAS officer, who is supposedly a trained professional, decides to take the mother's word for it when she said her ex was violent towards her. The court has since ruled unequivocally that this was not a no-contact case, and that contact must be resumed without delay, but it's taken us 2 years to get to this point, and I very much doubt that we are over. I've had a case recently where the police refused to return a child to my male client because they wouldn't accept that the court had ordered the child to live with the father, not the mother. I had a court order in front of them and they said they didn't understand it. It couldn't have been written in the more simple English. The two police officers, sadly both female, said that the child seemed happy with the mother, and the fact that the mother's boyfriend is also a very senior police officer, I'm sure played no part in their decision-making process. However, the order was very clear that the child should live with the father, and if the police can't be trusted to uphold court orders, why are the fathers going to have any faith in the system? You may say that these are isolated cases, or perhaps my clients have just been unlucky. And there are possibly some people that will think that simply because the woman couldn't prove there'd been abuse doesn't mean that they were lying, and that my client simply got away with it because I'm good at what I do. But I've got records that say otherwise. A recent national survey conducted by YouGov reveals that 8% of Americans report being falsely accused of domestic violence, child abuse, sexual assault, or other forms of abuse. That 8% represents 20 million adults. In 62% of cases, the false accusers were reported to be females. Often the false allegations were made in the context of child custody disputes. In the UK, the picture is similar. The Metropolitan Police reporting, for example, that in 2021, where an allegation of domestic violence was found to be false, 75% of the time it was the woman that had made the allegation that was later found to be untrue. So if we're going to properly address the issue of domestic violence and how we stop it, we also have to stop those who play the system by making up allegations of domestic violence as a mechanism to get what they want. Not only does it damage the men wrongly accused and their children, but they are denied access. But it discredits also those who have genuinely suffered from domestic violence, who are at risk of being tarred by the same brush. I think whilst that might be controversial, I think we are all agreed so far that the focus has to be on education, specifically those who are making the decisions. The police, the lawyers, the social workers and the courts need to recognise that there are often three sides to every story and that they shouldn't take anything as face value. So if it were me, if I had the magic wand, I would be finding more money and I would be using that money for more training, because if we don't train the people that are enforcing these decisions, it's never going to go right. Doesn't matter how good your law is, if the people enforcing it don't understand it, they're never going to be able to enforce it properly.
Thank you, Steph. So you're saying that we have to really make the laws, but that law has to be put into action by the correct and appropriate training. It's interesting because everybody on this panel will concur with you, because unfortunately the few rotten apples ruin it for everybody else, and using positive discrimination with domestic violence is probably the most cruel, unbelievable stance for anyone to take, because we're actually using somebody's terror and abuse and harm, whether it's coercive, physical, whatever it is. And we are taking that power away from what's real for people. And hence the police are knocking on the door and knocking on the door and knocking on the door. And at what point do they knock that door down? A lawyer.
It's a hard one, because the police are often having to make split-second decisions, knowing that if they get the decision wrong, yes, Carolyn said, you make the wrong decision, you might be out of a job. On the other hand, you make the wrong decision, somebody could die. It's a huge responsibility, and I don't think they are given enough training and support to make those kinds of decisions.
Well, and also we haven't just got the act of the physical abuse. We've got, my argument worldwide is about suicides and domestic violence. Most men kill themselves in domestic violence abuse situations. Women are a very close second, and if we spoke to anybody that's been in an abusive relationship, they've thought at some point, whether they've got children or not, of taking their own life. So we've got that other layer too. So what I'm hearing you say is make a law where we can actually discern what's real and have the apparatus and the system in place to discern what's real and what's falsified. Have consequences for people falsifying DV, because that would be wonderful. I'd be really pleased with that, because I work with, over the last 30 years, I've worked with a lot of cases where I'm thinking, you got away with that?
Yep.
And also what I'm hearing you say, Steph, and you're very brave to say what you've said today, and thank you, because we do need the balance. We do need the reality and the truth and it's always truth that wins through. You've brought something very important, which is, again, as Sarah said, and it's the training. We have to train people,
Yep.
the gatekeepers of DV, because a law will only inform us what the parameters are. It's actually how that's enforced and implied. Thank you, Steph. Michelle, thank you. Now, Michelle is an amazing advocate to help train and teach people about domestic violence. She's much prettier than me and much more glamorous the way she does it, but she does an amazing job. And the passion comes very deep. So thank you for being here today. What would you do about Michaela's Law?
Thank you. Well, I'm in such great company here. I'm honored to be here. And my passion and what I can speak to personally comes from my experience too. And it's mostly with emotional abuse, emotional addiction, and trauma bonding. And I think that is a common sort of thread through anyone whose lives have been connected to any kind of domestic violence. The common, phrase we hear is, "Why didn't they just leave?" And as we know, this is not something that you can just do. Usually people end up in these situations because they grew up in a specific way that caused them to be attracted or allow certain things in their life. And so it's a deep-rooted issue on both sides. Both the abusee and the abuser are living with trauma that's not been dealt with from the past. And unfortunately, the only way to ultimately change it is to start helping people at an earlier age, in a perfect world. However, it's all about education. I agree. I think, my big thing is knowledge is power. And the only way we can make change, the first step to healing, the first step to making change in the community, is to raise awareness and knowledge about the truth about this. Sometimes I feel that the abusees, they're their own enemy. We're knocking ourselves down because we have such shame, and then we don't believe in ourselves. And then, of course, the abuser is filling the minds of these people. And I know I've been there, with messages that you can't do it, that you're not worth it, that there's no way out. And with people dealing with things like financial dependence on their abusers, and being emotionally addicted to them, and fear for revenge, it's a scary thing. And I think the number one first step is just spreading knowledge and giving the education to those first line people that come in contact with them, like the law enforcement. There's I'm sure most of the people are familiar with a documentary that Cynthia Hill directed, Private Violence. And in it, she states that 50 to 75% of domestic violence victims, homicides, occur after they leave. And so it's a really scary thought that even when you get someone out of the dangerous situation at home, they're still at great risk of revenge occurring. And even in cases when you are fortunate enough to possibly press charges against the abuser and they're detained, eventually they will probably be released more angry and more vengeful than they were before. So having, my, of course, arena, counseling and coaching, I'm so passionate about the fact that we really do need to implement more programs for counseling, because even if we lock someone up for a little while, they're only going to, it's been proven they come out more angry. They're not learning how to really, as a whole, they're not learning how to heal whatever it is inside of them that's caused them to be so aggressive and take their hurt out on other people, because we're all walking around, wounded, and we have to learn how to take care of ourselves and live in a society with less destructive ways of handling it. And I think there's such importance placed on the false allegations. I was speaking with a woman last year who was married and they had a young child, and the husband was very emotionally abusive, and many times it would turn to anger and rage. And one time it got to the point where she feared for her safety and she called 911. And when she called 911, he rushed to the garage, beat his face up with a pole, and told the police when they arrived that she had beat him up. At the time she had COVID, and they said, if you did not have COVID, we would be taking you in. And I thought, she would have had that on her record, that she was, that she was brought in for domestic violence, whether charges were made or not, that would have been on her record. And then her ability to care for herself and her child in the future would have been taken away. So I think that's such an important element to think about. And another one is, and this is a whole different arena, but it's such a mess in our country, and that is firearm laws. And something perhaps in the legal system that could be connected to domestic violence would be fantastic, because currently in the state of Florida, if you steal a horse, it is punishable by death, specifically hanging. Yet if you're charged with domestic violence charges, you do not have to relinquish your firearms. And I think that right there is a crime in itself. These are people that have issues and they don't know how to handle them. I also read an article in The Guardian. It was a 2014 article, so I can't speak to whether or not they're doing this still, but it was just an idea of thinking outside of the box. And they talked about how in Tel Aviv, they actually will take the victim. I mean, typically you would take the victim out of the home. I'm sorry, abusee. I'm trying to use better language myself, and put them in a domestic violence shelter. And they said, respectfully, it's really like an experience of going to a refugee camp. However, in Tel Aviv, they were taking the abuser out of the home and placing them in a facility for 4-month stay, and giving, obviously I'm assuming they were giving them mandatory counseling services and so forth. But the point is, what if we think outside the box with options, even if it were on a first call or a second call, and the abuser is required to go through a certain program for a length of time that could actually make a difference. Taking in our country, taking the abuser out of the home for a day or so just to have things cool down at home, that doesn't work.
Michelle, would you be saying that there should be consequences for the abusers?
Yes.
That's a wonderful idea. That's a wonderful idea. No, thank you so much. What I'm hearing, it's interesting, as I've been making lots of notes, you've been talking, I've got fear and addiction creates people to stay. We've got shame that stops people reaching out. And the truth of it is, when you reach out, there's troubled protection. Because I'm not going to say there's never, because my nephew's a cop, there's never protection, but there's a lot of non-protection. And in actual fact, it's not uncommon for the abusee to be cross-questioned and tried in a most terrible, drastic way. I once had a patient that was raped by a German officer, terribly so, and she was flown to Germany and put in the same courtroom 6 feet from him. And this guy was 3 times the size of her, and he had all his friends around, all saying she was looking for it. How do we stop that? And then not only the rapist could identify her from that fuzzy night, but also all his mates could. What do we do with that? How do we create a protective environment for abusees? Or let's go one step further, Michelle, and say, how do we, and you mentioned youth, which is a very, very great idea. How do we protect people before they become an abusee? What do we do? What do we put in law? Because the law really is about protecting the abusees, but really the law should be about consequences if you cross that line and what that line is, because that's what gets very grey. So what would you say, Michelle, would be your one hit for the law to say, let's get rid of this addiction, the shame, the fear, all these aspects which are subjective, get in there with the youth, get people to understand what's dangerous, what the lines are, and then have that uphold. What would we do? What would we say the one line should be in the law?
Yeah, gosh, it's difficult to just narrow it to one line, but I would say, education on what it looks like. What are the signs of a child coming from a home, even if it, and I hate to say the word just, because emotional abuse is, you may not be able to die with one blow, but you will eventually if it goes on forever. But even if it's not physical abuse, but emotional abuse going on at home at a level where the child is having issues. When I was a kid, I had dyslexia, and granted, they didn't know as much about it, but I was stuck at the back table. They'd sit with me for an hour and work with me, but yet we've got kids coming in with obvious signs that something's going on at home that isn't right. And there is none of this going on. Our ratio of school counselors to children in our school system across the entire country, with the exception of a couple of towns, is vastly under the ratio that it is recommended. And even the recommended number is sick. So I really think that really educating educators on what the signs look like. And then, what consequence could there be if you actually helped a kid who may not have it so bad at home? You're just enforcing good things in their life. There is no bad consequence.
Good. Well, thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
So really, I'm hearing education, education, and education, and then implementing that.
Yeah.
Baron and I had a discussion some time ago, and I could have talked to Baron for weeks. This may sound weird, but Baron can put a very excitable, interesting and passionate twist on toxic relationships. He does great work, and I like his work, and I look at it often. Baron, thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here amongst fellow educators and healers. I myself when I was reading the story of Michaela, there was a deep personal connection because I myself have gone through the same type of abuse. When I went back and did my trauma timeline, it was pretty evident that in the 30 plus years of my adult life, in which I've been alive for 38 years, that I've been dealing with these type of abusers. So her story really resonated with me, as most survivors' stories resonate with one another, because the specific abuse tactics may be catered towards each individual person, but overall, at the core of it, it's the same. And the key thing that really stuck in my mind was when I was reading your article about Michaela, when you were doing one of her coaching sessions. She said that she thought she could heal him. And it took me right back to the very start of my 12-year relationship with an abuser. And I said to myself verbatim, I'm going to be the one that heals her. And I realized at that point that we both made a core decision to be the healer in that relationship. And that's a core stabilizing factor when it comes to these abusive relationships. It's the foundation that the abuser uses to continue their abuse indoctrination. So essentially, and as you were reading through her story, that's what was happening. They start you off getting an investment. They start you off with the love bombing, the mirroring of your characteristics. They start you off future faking in terms of providing you a fake future that they never intend to complete. And that creates that initial investment. And once they have that initial investment, they can start their process of the abuse indoctrination, to where the love bombing may happen, but then all of a sudden they're berating you and they're yelling at you. Then you'll get a shorter cycle of love bombing, which is followed by maybe them punching a wall. Then you'll get a fake apology, which is followed by them putting hands on you physically. And then from that point, they're just breadcrumbing. But throughout the whole process, the abuse is escalating, your tolerance for abuse is escalating, and the fake love is diminishing. And it was heart-wrenching to read that story because there were so many times that Michaela's life could have been saved. The family knew. Michaela knew something was wrong deep down inside. And as all this was happening, you still saw, even when the gentleman went to jail for abusing her, he was still using the abusive tactics, was sending her love letters with the fake promises, and then followed with a request for money so he doesn't have to eat the prison food. So for me, when I think about something you can do in order to help, in order to put a law in place to prevent this from happening again, education is the key. You have to inform people of what abuse looks like, not just on a surface level, but how that partner responds, how the abusee already has the core foundational belief that that relationship can work. So they're not going to be interested in pressing charges. They're going to find ways to hold out hope for that future. And that's where we need to step in, because the infrastructure was already in place. She was already on the list for vulnerable partners that could be hurt by domestic abuse. So the infrastructure was there. It's a multi-pronged attack, because you're not going to win the war just on the front of education. So once you have the education in place for the officers, you'll have something in place for the victims as well. So here in the States, if you have a DUI, there are mandatory classes that you have to go to in order to get your license back. There should be some type of mandatory class, therapy-led, that can teach that person, hey, what you're going through is a form of abuse. That person should be knowledgeable on all forms of abuse, physical, emotional, financial abuse, to teach them what they're going through so that they can start to break the foundation that the abusee has built within themselves, so that they'll know to walk away, even in the absence of a law officer or in the absence of anybody else intervening.
Thank you, Barry. I think what I'm hearing from you is very clear, and again, it's a wonderful. You're all miracle givers here today, because I'm getting all the bits of my whole argument from my mind from each of you, and being proactive and reactive is so important in this arena. Rehabilitation, wouldn't that be great? What a concept. But it's really good that you said, because I love the videos and stuff you put up. I think they're very helpful. People that know what they're doing. I'm 30 years in this business. I kind of know all the angles. I know about I've sat there with cops breaking their hearts because someone's been killed. You know, they're not cold people. There are some bad apples for sure. They're not cold people. They run towards the fires. We all run towards the fires. We support people. We all get affected by different cases. None of us are exempt from that. But how do we rehabilitate someone with the appropriate training? How do we do something that's proactive and show people where shame belongs, where the line is? If someone crosses that, we have it physically with sexual abuse in school, saying, if you touch this part of my body, that's not right. And I can tell somebody about that and I will be okay. Why not have that for the mind and the heart and the soul? Because a lot of kids that are being abused, Baron, they don't realize they're being abused. It's normal for them. That's their small world. And they can go one of two ways. They can go along the path of being an abuser themselves, or they can go along the path of being an abusee, or through wonderful work such as therapy or education. Some people choose a different track, thankfully. Baron, what would be the one-liner you would put in the law of Michaela's law to help be proactive or reactive?
Early education in terms of letting people know the signals of the abuse. So in high school, you'll have the classes for the wood shopping and you'll have the classes for the cooking. Give them classes that helps them understand the interpersonal relationships that are acceptable, that are not, that are abusive. Give them the tools that they need so that as they move forward and when they do encounter these people, which they will, they'll know how to better navigate them and not entrench them into their lives.
Thank you, Baron. It's always good to see you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Women's Fund, I don't know how the heck you do your job. Myra's the head of the Women's Fund. She raises money, she helps allocate money. She's got an amazing board. We're part of that board for many years. You help people from prison to safety to it's just amazing. I'm always in awe of the work you do. So I'm going to be very interested to hear from your multidimensional angle and your experience over the years, what you would put in Michaela's law. What would be your take on what you've heard today?
Michael, first, I thank you. And I thank everyone. You know, sometimes they say it's difficult to be the last, but in this case, I think I'm really grateful. I am, you know, my name is Maria Meyer. I do lead the Women's Fund Miami-Dade. We have a global perspective, but we act locally. And I think that applies here. We're talking about an international incident that has global repercussions, and the expertise that's gathered here today is like the tip of an iceberg that can remind us all there are best practices and there are new iterations and science and systems that are being experimented and improved on every day. And if we can grasp that, and with that pierce the numbness, the veil of numbness that does happen when people feel disempowered, to deal with something that is as human and has such a long history as intimate partner violence, translating to all its multitudinous forms. So I think I'm going to try and answer some of your questions in advance, the magic wands, maybe more than one, Michael, if I may, my privilege of being the last here.
I'll give you as many as you want in 7 minutes.
Well, I'm just really tying together so much of the collective genius that's been presented here today. I think there are quite a few things. Laws are very, very important, and laws are supposed to respond to the community. Those people report to us. And if we as a community don't have the critical mass of will and of understanding to require laws that are sensitive and updated, then they're stagnant, and then they're not, even worse, enforced, right? So new laws are important because they shed new light. And I think the combination of stories along with data and science are really critical. And it's a bright time in that sense. That we do have communication that's global, and we do have a lot of experimentation. We do have a lot more data. So things that we know now that we did not know before. We did not know about the neuroscience of trauma. Most laws for intimate partner violence across history have not been informed by the science of neuroscience because we didn't know. We did not know that neural pathways are forged and made to be different as trauma is repeated, right? As isolation allows trauma to be repeated, right? So these are brand new concepts for us, and most people don't get it yet. So we do need to educate, and we need to keep on having the conversations so you give people hope. And I'm not just talking about people who are in the situations. I'm talking especially about the people who, and that includes all of us, who will encounter those situations. If 1 out of 3 women or girls will be raped or beaten in her lifetime globally, if 1 out of 4 women and 1 out of 4 men reportedly in the US at least are going to experience intimate partner violence, it's crossing every single path, whether it's at the grocery store, at the school, whether it's your neighbor, somebody that you're related to, is going to cross your path. And when you do, you don't want to be numb, right? So I think magic wand, would be that laws are reviewed, maybe reviewed every 2 years. What is the latest science? What are the latest best practices? What do we now know that we did not know before, and how can we apply that here? I think that's one magic wand. I think so many have said, Sarah said before, Judge Zabel, before she got off, being in silos slows us down. So it's important for us to be working in our individual work. People are understanding, the scientists, the counselors, historians are working, but then we need to hop out of our silos and create a post-silo movement by coming together, and thus accelerating movement forward on these issues. There's so much that we can do when we share information. We need to have public awareness be strong. I mean, here in Miami, and Michael, as you and others know, at the Women's Fund, we do public awareness campaigns as well. So we did the official Stop Sex Trafficking campaign of the Miami Super Bowl host committee, big, huge billboards, etc. Do billboards necessarily stop intimate partner violence? No, but do they make you think that there's probably something that you could do about it? Yes. And is having a phone number right in front of your nose, day in and day out, making it accessible, does that make a difference for when it crosses your path? Yes. Does having stories told on the news, or in even in mass media, even on television, true to life, good representations of what trauma really can look like, does that help us to feel like we're empowered? Yes, that also makes a difference. Right. So public awareness is actually very, very key. And then it's the political will that once somebody does take action, that people are going to coordinate behind the scenes. When somebody's under duress, it's extraordinarily, it's crazy. It's unconscionable that we as a society think that somebody who's under great duress should be the one who's responsible for finding the perfect door to knock on. Right. You should be able to call in the United States, 211, 311, 911, and be taken to services. Right. And I think that's really important, that we take responsibility to get out of the silos behind the scene as well. So there's another magic wand, Michael. Our mayor here has a policy of no wrong door for everything when you knock on the county doors in the intimate partner violence, and that's interdigitated with domestic violence, human trafficking, all different kinds of things. We should have no wrong door. So that's another magic wand. And then this concept that more than one of you have brought up, trauma resolution and early intervention, not only for the person who's, for the perpetrator. So the perpetrator is coming from violence and from trauma most often, whether we understand that fully yet or not. Science and history is pointing there, right? So early trauma intervention for perpetrator and the person who is on the receiving side of abuse, absolutely necessary, and contemporaries of looking at that, not this good and evil, sinner saint kind of mentality, but we're all human, and it could happen to anyone, and trauma on top of trauma needs to be unraveled. So having services available, I think, is absolutely critical. And Baron, you brought up the drunk driving school, mandatory go to drunk driving school. Here in Miami-Dade County and in many other municipalities, there's a similar, a parallel program, for human trafficking and sex trafficking specifically. There's a restorative justice program. So first-time buyers of sex can see behind the scenes how it's not so beautiful, how trauma, coercion, layers and layers of abuse are often behind what is this the commercial
Thank you
sales
for
sex.
bringing-
There's something that could happen in the same way in domestic abuse. I agree with you there.
Thank you for bringing all of that up. You did a wonderful synopsis, so I don't have to now. But also what you brought in, and something that I really feel strongly about, is the bottom-up processing of information that informs services, informs education, informs the law. And often, because of public policy, politicians, etc., it's top-down processing where we're told what we should do, rather than people experiencing it, saying, hey, this will be helpful. And a fantastic example of that, Myra, is the airlines, when the stewards were saying, we are constantly seeing these people that are being held against their will, drugged, taken again. I mean, they can be children, they can be adult. We don't know what to do, and we can't do this anymore because we're seeing it more and more and more and more and more on airlines. And don't forget, these are British Airways, Virgin, the Delta, US Air, all the way. And they were saying, we can't do this anymore because we're going home and we can't stop thinking about that woman looking at us and being terrified and looking down, or that little boy that kind of didn't look like he should be with that man. And that's a really good example of bottom-up processing, where we listen to the people it's happening to, we listen to the people working in the industry, and we make laws and policy accordingly with trained people. And it's interesting what you said about the perpetrator. I don't work with perpetrators per se, but I do when I work in a family in trauma or a couple in trauma. And one of my wonderful visualizations for a perpetrator is that generally people all love dogs, cats, horses, or some kind of animal, normally dogs. And I always bring in, okay, so let's pretend your husband or wife or whoever it is a little puppy dog that's very loyal and keeps on coming back, and you kick it and it comes back and you kick it and it comes back. And then you don't feed it because it's been naughty, not allowed to kick it anymore. So now you don't feed it. And the little puppy dog is sitting there thinking, I might be fed at some point. That little puppy dog's sitting there not being fed for a long time, whether it's emotionally or physically or food, whatever it is. And you're doing that constantly. And that little puppy dog still comes back to you for more. How is that for you? And sometimes because of the history of abuse, sometimes because of the history of experience in a traumatic, abusive family, the person can come out of their situation and think, God, I'm actually doing that. I wouldn't do that to a puppy dog. I'm doing it to you. And sometimes we have to do that. And that's something I've learned in my practice over the years. And it's nowhere in my training. It's nowhere in, the helping perpetrators of domestic. It's nowhere, but it really works. Imagery is an amazing thing for humans. I'm going to pass over to you guys now. Everyone's unmuted, so we can talk. We've got 15 minutes left. Thank you, Myra, again, for all of the work you do. It's very selfless in so many ways, and you do help thousands of people, so thank you for that. Over to you guys. Any questions for me or other panelists, or what's your take from today? Because I'm a bit shaky because I want this to go on for years with thousands of people, because I think that's the only way this is going to make a difference. Education perpetrators and abusees seems to be on the cards. How we put that into law, I'm not sure, but it definitely has to be trained people. So over to you.
I'd just like to say something about, it occurred to me, something that sort of proves that the whole raising awareness works is, and I'm going to reveal my age here, but I'm in my 50s, but back when Oprah, I feel like she is such an angel and so responsible for raising awareness about so many secrets that people had in their life and thought that they might be the only one that went through it, or too shame to say it out loud, even to a counselor, people that had been molested and abused growing up. And Oprah brought these really fragile and difficult topics up and started talking about it and having experts on. And it was almost like a phenomena happened where people were all of a sudden talking to their spouses or talking to professionals and talking to their friends about what they experienced. And I think that the same thing needs to happen again, but as you've all mentioned, in a more modern way, in a more educated way. Neuroscience is definitely like the key here. And it's also proof that we can change, how someone operates. And I also loved the whole concept of not facilitating hate. We're not here to, every time I try to, raise awareness about narcissistic behavior, I always want to follow it with, this isn't to create enemies. These are wounded people themselves, and it doesn't mean you have to allow it. It just means have compassion on them, but you need to protect yourself, until that person's different, or just don't go back. But the point is, I think it's such a great point, because if we start facilitating hate within people, we're not empowering them.
I think we should be starting with the schools. I worked with a charity some years ago that was working with Indian schools in India, trying to educate boys about why violence towards women was wrong, because they were being brought up in families where it was considered normal. So unless you got in early and educated them that actually just because your dad does it doesn't mean it's okay, it was, by the time they were adults, it was too late. Get them at kind of early teens and there was still hope, and they were seeing some success. It's a big job and they were a small organization, but they were seeing results, because if you can talk to the boys when they're 10, 11, 12, they're still susceptible, they're still open to listening to other people's ideas.
I think for me, almost like the younger the better. We know that a lot of our belief systems are set really early on. Obviously there's people on this panel who are more educated than I am on quite when that is, but I was always I guess informed that was somewhere like before the age of 7. So I would even say at 10, 11, 12 and teenage years is too late, because you've normally got a belief system that's pretty hardwired by that point, usually about yourself. That whole I'm not good enough, I'm not worthy, the story of our imperfection happens very early in our lives, and that sense that we're imperfect and we have to find ways to sort of reinforce that story, but also to put faith in it. Then that us being open to be either being the abusee or the abuser on the back of that, I think happens very, very early. So and again, it's all about appropriate language and the right intervention. But I think there are ways of having those conversations about self-worth and about what good and bad looks like, and right and wrong, and self-confidence and boundaries and the power of no, and all of those things that can happen at a really early age. And I think, again, for me, it's about education, but also if I think about the programs that we've had, certainly in the UK, I think it's about standardized education, not lots of different agencies that are all doing their own thing and their own take on it. And then it's, it becomes a bun fight of who's going to educate who. I think standardized, well-informed, factual, and I think, as Mara said, really up-to-date information that forms the basis of that education.
For anybody that's guided someone out of a narcissistic or abusive relationship, what would you say that the person's key determining factor for their escape and their recovery was? What would you say they would tell you would be?
Well, I could answer that. I guess I've written a couple of books about it. Usually it's life or death. Either they're living death or they're going to die.
The people that I've dealt with, it was more about the emotional abuse. And there were threats that made them feel unsafe, threats that I am going to go use my gun collection to, come back and hurt you or something, but they had not laid hands on the person yet. So even though they had a fear for their safety, I don't know if death was there yet. However, it was almost, they had to just finally have enough. They thought, I don't know that I can survive any longer emotionally living this way. What do they say? You don't change until the desire to change is greater than the desire to remain the same. So I guess, they were just exhausted emotionally from putting up with it.
Thank you, Michelle. And Baron, in further answer, and Mara, I'm sure you've experienced this a lot too. but suicide is very prevalent in the field of abuse, and it's especially coercive abuse. And I can't tell you how many times in my career, both at the hospitals and in private practice, that we've called back somebody to reach out for help and they're dead. And on the death certificate is not domestic violence, coercive control, breakup of a relationship. It's actually, well, they were feeling in a low mood and they took the pill, or whatever they did to do the act. But it's really hidden. It's invisible. The end for a lot of people is invisible. And another thing about Michaela, and let's humanize this, Michaela was a beautiful soul. She was kind, she was loving. She was one of the best stewards on Virgin Atlantic Airlines. She had everything you could possibly make people in first class feel like they're kings and queens, or others, or whatever we call it these days. But I mean, amazing soul. And the sad thing is that she died obsessed and loving her killer. And that's the truth of this. And people die from suicide on their own, and we can't hold their hands. We couldn't hold Michaela's hand. And that's why I'm so passionate about Michaela's Law, that we need to find a way of preventing and being proactive. And we need to find a way of being reactive and proactive, so there aren't repeat offenders and repeat abusees. No.
Add to everything that you said, Barona, just a few tips that I've learned from lots of ingenious people along the way. One of them is if you're able to help somebody get a plan, just like they say, you've got to take somebody very seriously if they seem to have a suicidal plan. Well, it also works for good. Since the most dangerous time when somebody leaving a domestic abuse situation is the time of departure, having a real infrastructure and people that you can trust and having a real plan is one of the greatest supports for success.
May I add to that, Mara? And I did this in your panel a few months ago, that having a real plan, a safe plan. If you're watching this and you're thinking, gosh, me, do not do a knee-jerk reaction. Do not just get up and do something. You have to think about it, make sure you're safe, have as much support as you can, and try and leave permanently, and have that in mind to leave permanently. A lot of people leave to go back, and it sounds crazy, but they do. If you're going to leave safely, and leave so there aren't consequences.
Children can be a support. If you can't take care of yourself, you can be afraid enough and have your instincts of needing to protect your children, and they are the most vulnerable in these situations. And then another thing that I find really interesting is the number 7 of that. It usually takes 7 times, an average of 7 times for somebody who's in a domestic violence situation, intimate partner violence situation, to leave. So you don't know if you're somebody who's offering support the first time or the 6th time, and not giving up of caring and listening wholeheartedly to the person who'd be in the situation without judgment, but full of resources. Not giving up. I think that's one of those things. You never know. You might be the 5th angel.
And to be mindful too, Mara, that if they are the 6th, if you are the 6th or 7th, then probably everybody else has given up on them, because that's what happens. That the support network just dribbles away, it ebbs away. We have to quick wrap. We've got 2 minutes. I think I've done excellently with timing. You've done excellently with all your experience and knowledge. I thank you very much. We will be adding something to the end of this from me, and then we will be sharing it with you. The BBC people were here today with us too, so we're very grateful to them. And Newsweek will probably do something more on this with us. And everything you've said and everything you've experienced, but more importantly, your passion and you spending this time with me today and with each other is phenomenal, and it won't go to waste. So from the bottom of my heart and from the bottom of the heart of everybody we help with this, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. And to BBC and Newsweek, we can't do it alone, can we? Right? It's brilliant for their support for you. Thank you. Nice to meet you all.
You too.